Welcome to the Myeloma Matters podcast, hosted by the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, and focusing on patients' experiences with and perspectives on multiple myeloma topics that matter to anyone affected by this blood cancer. In this episode, you'll learn about targeted immunotherapy, a unique type of myeloma treatment that actively targets myeloma cells. We'll hear from 3 patients who have been on targeted immunotherapy to get a sense of the patient experience, and we'll discuss how these patients wound up receiving targeted immunotherapy. Please note that every myeloma patient is unique. The information in this podcast is not intended to replace the services or advice of trained healthcare professionals. Please consult with your healthcare team or contact the MMRF Patient Navigation Center at 1-888-841-6673 if you have specific questions about your health. The path to a diagnosis of multiple myeloma looks different for everyone. For patients like John Wayland, myeloma is first detected during a routine physical. John was diagnosed with multiple myeloma in 2016 after his primary care physician decided to follow up on some abnormal blood work results.
Called me on President's Day 2016 in the afternoon. I remember I was grilling. My sister and brother-in-law were in town and said, I'm going to need to make a referral to a hematology oncologist. And so I said, well, that certainly is not good news.
For others, myeloma isn't detected until it has significantly affected other organs. This was the case for Eric Ellefson and Brenda Clark, the other guests we'll hear from in this episode. Eric was a 33-year-old high school principal in southwest Chicago when he started developing vision problems. When he visited his eye doctor, he learned that he had a hemorrhage in his retina. The doctor knew it was an issue with either his blood or his brain and referred him for an MRI and blood work.
But then when I went for the blood test, it was like those old, it's like the oil commercials where they showed the old viscous oil versus the new oil. The blood was barely coming out of my veins.
Likewise, Brenda was diagnosed with multiple myeloma after seeking care for another health concern. In January 2010, Brenda knew something wasn't quite right. She was recovering from knee replacement surgery and contacted her cardiologist to tell him she wasn't feeling well. After running some tests, Brenda's cardiologist told her to go to the emergency room right away.
So I went, and they gave me a vial, and they said, we need you to go ahead and provide a sample for us. And I said, what? And the doctor at the emergency room said, you're in renal failure.
After running more tests to determine the cause of her renal failure, Brenda's doctor called in a hematologist who diagnosed her with multiple myeloma.
He said, I tell you what, once we get you in treatment, then all this other may fall into place.
Multiple myeloma treatment typically begins with several cycles of induction therapy, which typically consists of 3, sometimes even 4, types of medications. These cycles of therapy are usually followed in patients who are eligible by an autologous stem cell transplant and maintenance therapy with Revlimid. For many people, this initial treatment strategy works well. Most patients respond to the point where the level of M protein in the blood drops. This was the case for John, who had over 2 years of a response after getting a stem cell transplant and standard maintenance therapy.
My induction therapy was Revlimid, Velcade, dexamethasone, and I think we did either 6 or 7 cycles. I had a very fast and strong response to the drugs, and that led up to a autologous stem cell transplant at that started in September of 2016. I had a very good result from that. I got down to no discernible M spike, etc. Given kind of the higher risk profile that I had, I continued immediately after the stem cell transplant on maintenance therapy with Revlimid, Velcade, and dexamethasone.
But not everyone responds to this treatment. Some people with aggressive forms of myeloma may require several different medications or even a second stem cell transplant to get their disease under control. That was the case for both Brenda and Eric. For them, standard treatment approaches weren't enough, and they had to quickly move on to new kinds of therapy, or in Eric's case, a second stem cell transplant. Eric received several rounds of therapy and 2 stem cell transplants within 9 months of being diagnosed. In that time, he estimates that he spent 60% of his time in the hospital for treatment.
I spent a significant time in the hospital because they had me in and they did pheresis and they started on me on at that point in time, Velcade Dex. And then they'd send me home and it'd get worse. And so then I'd come back and then they'd do pheresis again and then Velcade Dex. And then they realized, well, it's send me home, it get worse. And then they sent me to a different hospital. That was the crazy, they were just trying to keep me alive, find a treatment. They didn't know what to do with me because I'd manifested in such an unusual way for them.
Brenda achieved a very good partial response after her transplant, but she also developed severe side effects from her treatments, including neuropathy and blood clots. Even among patients who initially responded well to induction therapy and transplant, many experience a relapse or recurrence of their disease that requires additional treatment. Multiple myeloma is characterized by periods of relapse and remission, and most patients need to try several treatment approaches to control their disease. John, Eric, and Brenda all reached points in their myeloma journey where they required a new approach to treatment. For John, that point came more than 2 years after his stem cell transplant, when his maintenance therapy stopped working. For Eric and Brenda, that point came much sooner. Fortunately, there are now many options available for treating myeloma that has relapsed or that does not respond to treatment. These options include several approaches and agents that are showing promising results in clinical trials. One of the most exciting new approaches to myeloma treatment is targeted immunotherapy, which has emerged as a strong option for many patients who require new treatments for their myeloma, including John, Eric, and Brenda. Targeted immunotherapy gets its name from the fact that it actually targets cancer cells based on the presence of certain markers found on the surface of myeloma cells. These therapies boost the body's ability to focus on and kill myeloma cells specifically. This is a major step up from older approaches, which used therapies that killed both good and bad cells. The markers that are used as targets for immunotherapy are proteins with names like CD38 or SLAM-F7. These proteins are found on the surface of both myeloma cells and healthy cells, though myeloma cells tend to have higher amounts of them, which is why they are useful as targets for anti-myeloma therapy. Different drugs are able to target different markers. For example, Darzalex and Sarclisa were designed to target CD38, whereas Implicity was designed to target SLAM-F7. Many new immunotherapies that are approved for use in multiple myeloma patients or are currently in development target another myeloma surface marker known as B-cell maturation antigen, or BCMA. BCMA is an especially attractive target for immunotherapies because it is found in abundance on almost all myeloma cells. A wide variety of novel immunotherapies target BCMA, including antibody-drug conjugates like Blenrep, chimeric antigen receptor, or CAR T-cell therapies like Abecma or Carvykti, and several new bispecific antibodies that are currently in clinical trials. The newest of these targeted immunotherapies, such as CAR T-cell therapies, have been able to induce responses in most patients with multiple myeloma, including those that have relapsed from several other prior therapies. John, Eric, and Brenda were all offered some form of these new immunotherapies in a clinical trial setting. For John, this occurred after he'd experienced several episodes of relapse, despite getting 2 rounds of stem cell transplant and 3 different combinations of maintenance therapy. Given the urgency of his situation, he was enrolled in the Magnetism trial, which was investigating a bispecific antibody that targets BCMA, plus another drug that helps enhance the expression of BCMA on myeloma cells.
I was hopeful that the approved and available pharmaceutical out there would keep things under control. And together with the stem cell transplant, And we kind of rapidly, over a 5-year period, worked our way through everything that was kind of approved and available. There really wasn't enough time to continue waiting for cell-to-cell, nor is there enough time to go through apheresis, the modification of the cells, et cetera. So, and number two, what Dr. Hoffman's seen is one of the study investigators, I think, is indicating that the bispecific antibody therapies are showing as promising results. Those two decision points put together led us towards the BITE trial.
John started treatment in the clinical trial early in the spring of 2022, and he's extremely optimistic. He achieved remission after only 4 months. As of August 2022, John was gearing up for bone marrow biopsies and imaging studies that would determine how deep that remission is. Early in the trial, he was challenged with more intense fatigue and nausea than he had had with other therapies, and he had to manage a case of low-grade cytokine release syndrome. John and his oncologist agreed to a reduction in one of the 2 study medications, which provided significant relief of his symptoms. John is confident that his participation in the Magnetism trial will help not only himself, but others with multiple myeloma. Eric expressed similar sentiments about the broader value of clinical trial participation. Eric's myeloma was well managed after his second transplant, but it never went away. After 11 years of maintenance therapy, the treatment started to take a toll on his well-being, so he spoke with his doctor about next steps. His doctor recommended a clinical trial of CAR T-cell therapy. Both Eric and Brenda were enrolled in CAR T-cell therapy clinical trials to help manage their disease, which never went into remission for either of them. Eric was, in fact, actually enrolled in 2 clinical trials, as the first therapy didn't work as well as his oncologist had hoped. Nevertheless, for both Eric and Brenda, CAR T-cell therapy was the answer they had been looking for.
Let me say this. After I had the first CAR T-cells, and, you have to go back every so often to get checked, and everything. So it was about 2 weeks later. 2 weeks later after I had had the CAR T-cells. So Dr. Flynn said, your multiple myeloma is gone. And when he told me that, the relief that I felt, the joy that I felt, I still remember that.
Eric's myeloma also responded quickly to his second CAR T-cell therapy. Both Brenda and Eric have been fortunate to be in remission for a while without needing additional treatment for their myeloma. Eric has been off treatment for more than a year, and Brenda for 4 years. Unfortunately, Brenda's myeloma has since relapsed since her treatment in 2016, and Eric's myeloma appears to be coming back as well. Despite this, both Brenda and Eric consider their treatments a success.
I think the one thing I've learned about CAR T, people talk about it so positively that then we ask that kind of what's the overall response rate, and then when you hear the overall response rate, it's actually kind of disappointing because it's like they said 10 months, and I'm like, what? I'm doing all this for 10 months? Mm-hmm. But then I realized, like, now a year after my second one, it's like, oh yeah, I'd do this for 10 months.
After more than a decade of nearly continuous treatment, Eric cherished the break.
I think it is that sense of, just living life without the ties to treatment. My life schedule for really 12 years was so tied to the ups and downs of what the drugs would make me feel and how they'd make me feel. And even I traveled a lot for work for a period of time. And so it's like, well, I can't travel here because this. So your life is built all around myeloma. And then it's really this interesting kind of phenomenon when, that I've experienced this last year of self-reflection, of like feeling more like myself.
But Eric and his doctors think that these novel treatments have broader potential. As Eric's oncologist told him, these novel therapies are paving the way for a brighter future in multiple myeloma treatment.
He told me in March, he's like, Eric, I truly do think for the first time that we might be able to cure this. to have that hope where I think early on in so many patients' lives, and there's a hopelessness that comes with myeloma that can be, and I felt it at times, and consistently it can be debilitating and overwhelming. Yeah. And so to have that hope that there's something next and that there's this option and that, like, for now, the next best hope are these kind of treatments that you're talking to patients about.
Treatment advances have also offered hope to Brenda, who reminds herself that even if there isn't a cure, myeloma treatment is advancing every day.
And the key to all of this is staying alive long enough so that you can get to that next drug or that next treatment that they may be coming out, because it's just around the corner. And you're just trying to get there to make sure that you can get that next treatment or get that next drug.
These improvements in treatment and the ever-advancing understanding of myeloma biology take a lot of work, and clinical trials are a key piece in putting together the puzzle. Although their experiences differed, John, Brenda, and Eric all received life-saving treatment thanks to the opportunity to participate in immunotherapy clinical trials.
I mean, that's where I encourage some of my other friends too, when they go into these places of like, should I do a trial or not? It's like, yeah, do it, because you're helping yourself, but then you're helping so many other patients behind you, whether it works or not.
Let's hear more from John, Eric, and Brenda, who are joined by Mary DeRome from the MMRF, who will share more about their experiences with targeted immunotherapy treatments and their insights on what factors to consider when deciding whether a clinical trial is right for you.
John, Eric, and Brenda, thank you so much for being with us today on our Myeloma Matters podcast, dealing with the topic of targeted immunotherapies in multiple myeloma. This is arguably the most important and most talked about topic in multiple myeloma today. You guys are all myeloma warriors with experience in having these immunotherapies, and we are really interested to hear about them, your experiences with them, how well they worked for you, and any words of wisdom that you might have for other patients who are considering these therapies. Let's talk about how getting a targeted immunotherapy might be different than getting some of the other more traditional drugs that you've been on. Eric, let's start with you.
I think the biggest difference for me was just the extent to what the immunotherapy required. And that was, the hospitalization, and it was the time in the hospital that was different than whether it is the oral medication or the infusion process.
Brenda, did you find it similar with your CAR T experience?
Absolutely. Also with the stem cell, I remember that just prepping for a stem cell was different, and it was more intensive for me. And I had a lot more problems with the stem cell than I did with the CAR T.
I guess that's good to hear. John, how about your experience with the bispecific?
So for the bispecific, much different than the 2 stem cell transplants I had previously. There was a required hospitalization for initial dosing, mainly to determine what side effects you might experience, and particularly for anybody who's going to have a heavy cytokine release syndrome issue. But outside of that, it is weekly treatment in the hospital, and I have a daily oral. So very similar to what you find on maintenance medications, or what I found on maintenance medications over time. The difference for me really was in terms of the magnitude of side effects that I experienced, which were significantly higher than I had had in the past.
We're going to talk a little bit about CAR T therapy right now with Brenda and Eric. So you both mentioned that preparing for the CAR T therapy was challenging. So how does preparing for that particular therapy compare to preparing for, let's say, an autologous stem cell transplant? I mean, I think, Brenda, you mentioned that for you, the CAR T preparation was not as bad as the stem cell transplant. So can you talk a little bit about what made these procedures more or less challenging for you, Brenda?
With the stem cell, you had to actually give yourself a shot so that you could increase your count. So to me, that was challenging. With the CAR T, I didn't have to do that. I had an outpatient stem cell as opposed to an inpatient stem cell. So that was more challenging. Also, I lost my hair with the stem cell, which for me, that was devastating.
I'm sure.
Whereas with CAR T, I didn't have that. Now, I did have to spend 14 days in the hospital with the CAR T, but I didn't find that more challenging because I had my laptop and I had my movies, and so that was not as challenging, and I didn't have the side effects that I had with the stem cell.
Eric, how about you? How did your CAR T compare to your stem cell?
You know, so much of what Brenda has said is that, you know, the stem cell transplant is much more difficult overall. I think, you know, the preparation, the chemotherapy, the side effects. I actually did double transplant, so I went back to back with mine. And so the weight of that, you know, back to back was really difficult for me when I look back at it. The biggest challenge for me was more of a mental and emotional challenge, in the sense that it was a trial, didn't know a lot of details. Didn't, you know, and that's part of me being on it was, you know, the doctors are also trying to figure out some of those things. And then in comparison to when I was diagnosed and then went through the stem cell process, that was all kind of hurried and rushed because of my situation that I was in. Whereas this one, I had the time to, in a sense, mentally and emotionally prepare, which actually in some ways was a detriment, because I found that the anxiety and my anxiousness for something I didn't know a whole lot about started to kick in. So, you know, very different experiences, challenges in you know, certain ways, but much more, I think, overall preferable to the stem cell transplant.
I think that a lot of patients probably share that. And was part of the anxiety that you felt when you were getting ready for your CAR T, were you worried about whether or not it was going to work for you?
100%. 100%. I think the worry is, like, they said it's similar to the stem cell transplant. So my worry was like, oh, I have to go through this again. So that was worry number one. Worry number two was like, I don't really know a whole lot about it. And I knew people who'd gone through the stem cell transplant process, so I could ask them questions to prepare myself, whereas I didn't necessarily have that opportunity. The clarity for the doctors was much less. And then with that big question, I'm going to go through all of this and it may not work. So yeah, 100%, the combination of those factors really, really, really kind of created some internal anxiety in the process.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about when you were in the hospital for your CAR T and then coming home. What was the role of your caregiver or your care partner? What did they have to know? And knowing what you know now, is there anything that you wish your caregiver could have done differently? Brenda?
As far as what they needed to know, they needed to my husband was my caretaker or caregiver, and he was watching for any kind of cognitive changes in my behavior or cognitive functioning. He was also fevers, chills, things like that. Anything out of the ordinary, neurological issues, anything like that was kind of not normal for me. He was watching for that. He also was my chef and my cook, my housekeeper. He did a lot of things. And when I was first going through that was before DoorDash and before grocery delivery. So he had to do all of that himself. And one thing that looking back on it, that I wish he could have done was ask for more help. And because he felt like he needed to do it all himself, and he didn't want to ask anyone. Plus, he was worried about infection, and he didn't want me to be exposed to anyone. And so he wanted to just be there and do it all. And I wanted him to know that he didn't have to do it all, but he wanted to.
Sounds like he did a great job.
He did an excellent job. Excellent job.
Eric, what was your situation like with your caregiver?
I think to Brenda's point about having a caregiver who feels like they have to do it all, I think we've learned over time to create a caregiving team. So that caregiving team in a lot of ways is my wife, you know, my sister-in-law, my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, you know, and so it is this group of people that has different roles, responsibilities, opportunities. So it doesn't rely solely on one person, even though, you know, my wife is definitely, you know, the chief of the caregivers. And, you know, in a lot of ways, like Brenda, same role, same responsibility. She's working full time, you know, taking care of her job and her work, but then also taking care of me. So having a sister-in-law who's willing to come in for a month from Europe to be able to live with us, work from our home, and to do the things that she needs to do while she transports me, drives me places, does a lot of the errands and taking care of me, so that then there is a shared nature of it. When I look back at the perspective of what might be an encouragement, I think it is, to Brenda's point about sharing roles and responsibilities, but I got both of my CAR Ts during COVID. And so there was this also heightened and continued heightened anxiety of limited contact with other people and limited contact with others. And I love people and I love being around people. And so, just kind of having those consistent conversations of what does it mean to stay safe, to allow yourself to heal, allow your immune system to come back, but then also for your overall well-being, the connections and contact that we need oftentimes as patients who've, spent significant time in isolation or alone.
It's quite an experience, right? As if going through this therapy is not bad enough, you had COVID on top of all of that, which just made everything so much more complicated.
And that was, I think that's, and Brenda, I don't know your experience on this. I think the time in the hospital, the 2 weeks in the hospital was really kind of like, it's take your entertainment stuff and it's to catch up, but it was actually surprisingly a place of peace and quiet before moving back into the space of home and the busyness of life.
I looked at it as a 2-week vacation. I enjoyed being in there. I was able to read. I was relaxing. I enjoyed it, just being there and just being by myself and not having to worry about anything.
And for your caregiver, it's like the calm before the storm.
Absolutely. But he was able to come to the hospital. This last one, he was able to come to the hospital and we played cards in there and, we just did all kind of little things that we really would not have had a chance to do at home. And so it was calming. It was real calming there.
John, let's get back to you for a little bit, John, and tell us about your experience when you were starting your bispecific and your caregiver and how that all went for you and your caregiver.
Just in terms of starting the bispecific, as I said, first of all, I was delayed starting because I had COVID in February. So I actually went on a drug holiday starting in December of 21. And was originally scheduled to start in the trial in January, was delayed because of a COVID infection. And I continued because they hospitalize you on the same floor that patients going through stem cell transplants are going through, even though you're just there for observation. Of course, everybody's very careful around potential infections. So I was actually delayed until mid-March in terms of starting the clinical trial treatment. Given I had never really had significant issues with any of the pharmaceuticals, and I'd taken pretty much all of them over the past 5 years, I really did not have any foresight or thought that I would have side effects from this trial treatment, that would create issues for me where I would need more caregiver support and wouldn't be able to return to work. I didn't have a plan B around any of this. So one thing I will say is that always expect the best, prepare for the worst. I did not prepare for the worst, which left us a little bit behind the 8 ball, as I guess you would say. From the caregiver perspective, my husband, Ulysses, was really responsible for 100% of everything. As Brenda provided and Eric seconded it, it was everything around the house, transportation to and from your appointments, everything. We also, and I think it's a great point that Eric made, in my prior stem cell transplants, as well as the clinical trial treatment, really did not establish a larger universe of caregivers to support the primary caregiver. I think that is an excellent point and something that people should take to heart and prepare for in that regard.
So almost like the caregiver also needs a caregiver.
Absolutely. And the other, which I had to adapt to, and I think this is important for patients, and probably everyone went through this, is when you're the patient and you require a caregiver and caregiving, you have to adapt your mentality to it. You know, you're going to be frustrated. You're going to want to do things on your own. I know I had to really adapt my overall responses and everything else to understand where I am, the importance that Ulysses is bringing to the table, and everybody has to learn to function in a different role for a period of time.
That makes sense. I mean, it really is a life-changing experience. So did the target of the immunotherapy that you guys had, at least Brenda for your first one, and Eric actually is for both of the ones that you've had, which is the target is BCMA. Did that mean anything to you when you were considering these treatments? And does it mean anything when you're thinking about future treatments? Eric, did that mean anything to you?
When I first started, it was like, no, I don't even understand what this means. And I made them draw diagrams. I made them explain it. And I asked the hard question, like, okay, so why am I now just becoming aware of this? And I think there is that place for the doctors where, you know, they are still, you know, they're just a few steps ahead of us. So it didn't mean much for me on the front end. I think for me now, it's just made me more educated and aware for the next steps.
Brenda, so you've had 2 CAR Ts, right? Only the first one was BCMA targeting, but you actually had that BCMA one 2 times, right? And now you're going to have the next CAR T, which actually is a different target. So what does that mean for you?
Well, for the BCMA, it meant something for me because I had done the research. So I knew that that's what I wanted to receive. So when they told me this is what it was going to target, I was like, great, I was looking forward to that. Now, because I've had the BCMA, I know that didn't work because of the second CAR T cell that I had. So now I'm looking, okay, what's another marker? But my next thing is, how do you know I really have that marker? And I'm hearing, well, everyone has it with multiple myeloma. Everyone has this marker. But how do you know I have this marker?
That makes sense to ask that question. John, your treatment, unlike the treatment that Brenda and Eric have, which is the CAR T, which people like to say it's a one and done, right? And then you basically don't have any other therapy, although it's not like you never go to the doctor. But the bispecific is different. You do have to go back to get treatments. Is it weekly or biweekly you have to get treatments, John?
So for the trial that I'm on, which is 2 drugs, the bispecific therapy drug that I'm on is called elranatamab. That is a weekly subcutaneous injection that I go to the hospital every Wednesday to receive. And then it is coupled with a second oral medication called nirogacestat. And so that's a daily pill that I take at home. Originally, I was taking a full dose, 2 pills in the morning, 2 in the evening, 12 hours apart. That really was the drug that was causing the majority of my side effects. So we were able to, thankfully, with permission from the trial, reduce my dosage by half. So now I take it once a day and has made a significant improvement in my side effects.
That's good to hear. So I know that the nirogacestat has something to do with the target BCMA, which is what the elranatamab is targeting. So do you know what that drug does, the oral drug, like how it helps your therapy work?
Sure. I'm going to give you, in layman's terms, what I understand of the drugs and the way that they interact. The bispecific antibody therapy that I'm on is a BCMA targeting bispecific, similar to the CAR Ts that we've been talking about. And one of the challenges, I think, for all of this immunotherapy, whether it's CAR T or bispecific, is durability, and particularly related to the nirogacestat is targeted at inhibiting the malignant cell's ability to shed the BCMA proteins, such that it continues to be a viable target for the bispecific antibody therapy overall.
From what you said, it sounds like the nirogacestat was the one that was causing you a lot of difficulties as far as side effects. So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. I had, at the full dosage of the nirogacestat, I did have a low to mid-level cytokine release syndrome issue. So I had breathing difficulty. I had a constant cough, all of which was related to this, which nothing kind of solved for. I also had a lot of gastrointestinal issues. I actually lost 35, almost 40 pounds between mid-March and mid-May. And that was after being down 20 pounds from December of last year to March. So I really got to a fairly unhealthy weight overall. I was also requiring a lot of support in terms of blood transfusions, given significant levels of anemia and very low platelets. I also required plasma infusions, et cetera. So it was overall, the side effects were significant in terms of the first couple of cycles of my treatment.
Well, it sounds like the dose reduction has worked, so that's great.
Wonderfully.
Good. I hope are you gaining some weight back?
I am. I'm actually up about 10 pounds, so I'm happy about that. I have appetite. I can eat. I'm starting to gain some weight back, so that's all very good news.
Good. Good for you. So Brenda and Eric, you've mentioned that being off treatment for an extended period of time after you began your CAR T has really changed how you handle things in life. So Brenda, let's start with you. So what has changed with your, the quote unquote one and done therapy?
Well, I'm not tied to a treatment. I'm not tied to, I have freedom of movement, or I had. I'm back on treatment now, but I had freedom of movement. And I could plan, if I wanted to go on a trip, I could just plan going on a trip. And you don't really think about things like that. Most people think, oh, well, I'll just plan a trip and I'll go. Well, if you're in treatment, you can't just plan a trip and go, because you have to plan around when you have to actually go back to get your blood drawn, or when you have to go to a doctor's appointment. So your time is not your own. Also, being off treatment gave my body, to me, time to heal. I have little small roly-poly veins, and so it gave my veins a chance not to have to be stuck, or not to have to be blood drawn out of my veins, and even the medication, just to be off the medication was good. And it made my body feel like it was recovering from whatever it was going through. And so just to be off of the medication for a while was good for me.
I can imagine after being on treatment for so long, being off treatment must be really almost life-changing. Eric, was it like that for you?
Oh, I 100% agree with Brenda. I think there's these places where, afterwards, I forgot I was a myeloma patient. The rhythms of life, I lived normal rhythms of life. I felt much more like myself. I looked much more like myself. One friend that I even had that saw me, he was surprised, because he's like, Eric, you look like I remember you. And so I think there's these places, to Brenda's point, you get to live life more freely. You get to forget about the myeloma at times and forget about it in many ways controlling your life and the rhythms of your life. And then I will say of all the side effects and everything, I was so glad and realized that I don't have to take dexamethasone for a while. So it's like, oh, not only, physically, but then mentally, emotionally, energy wise, and, all of those sorts of things is you do regain. This was the first treatment for me where I felt like I regained some sort of normal life.
So, Eric, what would you say to a patient who is considering an immunotherapy? So, yes, it can be, if you're taking a CAR T, it can be really great. You could go back to living your normal life, but it's not without risk, and it's not without side effects. So what would you say to a person who was talking to you about it and sort of wanted your advice about that?
I think for me, it would be, and Brenda's hit on it, John's hit on it, but, it is that I think what myeloma patients do, constantly and consistently is just asking lots of questions, doing research, exhausting. I do think there is a place where it's like, okay, I've exhausted, or I have pretty much exhausted, the other opportunities. Because I think even in this, one of the great worries is we don't want to run out of, the next treatment or the next treatment that might be in line, right? Because this is not a solution. This is not a cure. It's just a continuation of the treatment process. And so have I exhausted the steps along the way to get me to this? But the CAR T side of things, definitely I would say I would do it again over regular treatment most any time if the possibility was there.
Brenda, would you say the same?
Absolutely. I agree with Eric 100%. And well, I'm looking for more CAR T cell therapy or treatment options. That's, to me, is where I'm going with it. If I had a choice between regular treatment and CAR T, I'm going with CAR T.
So, John, you're in a little bit of a different boat with the bispecific, but I think that, we're looking forward to our first approval in the bispecifics arena in the not too distant future. So what would you say to a patient who might be considering going on a bispecific trial?
I would absolutely recommend it. I think, and similar to CAR T, for me, I needed something that was available immediately. With where I was. So that was one of the reasons that we went bispecific instead of CAR T. The side effects notwithstanding, you're going to have those pretty much from any treatment, and just being upfront with your doctor and your medical team and going through that, looking for a solution. The overall therapy has been great. I have reacted wonderfully to it. And in fact, I'm in definitional remission now. I just had a new bone marrow biopsy yesterday, and imaging studies will take place next week to see how deep that is. So I'm very, very excited about that. I was equally as excited as Brenda and Eric, and I'm sure lots of patients out there, when I found out past the initial 2 doses, I no longer had to take dexamethasone. So what a blessing that was. I was ecstatically excited. And in mid-November, after I complete 7 cycles of treatment, I'll move to biweekly, so twice a month. And so that leash to the hospital will be a little bit longer, allow for a little bit more normalcy of life. All good. Highly recommend it. I really do believe that the immunotherapy arena will be where the cure is found overall.
I do think that, there is a lot of hope in this field, particularly in immunotherapy. So we'll see where it all goes, and there's more drugs being approved all the time. John, what can you tell us about your experience of being on a clinical trial?
The clinical trial experience has been great. It's a little bit more involved in terms of interactions with the hospital. One of the nice things, I guess, is you see your doctor much more often. Generally, I'm on a kind of once a week schedule with he and his team. Going into it, similar to what I think Eric related, you do have to really adjust and accept where you are in the treatment continuum. I think we all, as patients and where we were with our disease and treatment, understand the importance of the clinical trials and the development of these new drugs. We don't really have another choice, then you shouldn't have an issue because you've got to go forward with it. But I did find educating myself as much as possible with publicly available materials and conversations with the medical team were very important, but I was comfortable from day one going into it.
Well, that's great to hear. Brenda, what was your experience like on the clinical trial? Did you like it or did you not like it?
Oh, I absolutely highly recommend clinical trials. With the CAR T, that was not my first time with being exposed to clinical trials. I will say that my preference is phase 2 and phase 3. I've been on some phase 1 clinical trials, and I'm not a big fan of phase 1 clinical trials.
Not a fan.
Not a fan. Not a fan at all.
So how come? Tell us why.
Well, because that's the first time that drug is actually being introduced. So I had some side effects from some of those drugs that I'm glad probably didn't make it to the market. They just had numbers to them and no names. Some of those were not too good. But overall, my experience with clinical trials have been really good, and I would not have had access to the CAR T without a clinical trial. So I'm a big advocate for clinical trials, especially when it relates to CAR T cell.
Eric, with the CAR Ts that you've taken, have you taken them on clinical trials or have they been approved?
So both of mine were phase 3 clinical trials. So I came at the end of all of the work that patients like Brenda, did, in phase 1. And so for me, I had the benefit of the doctors actually had better information, better knowledge, and they were in the place of the final revisions or refining, and then also getting that final data. So I think for me, the one trial I was on, the CAR T was approved a few months later. And so, so that was my first one. And so being in that stage, I think is probably very different in a trial phase than compared to, even what Brenda and John have experienced at the front end, being on the front end of these processes. So I would say overall, for me, it was very normative in a lot of ways. There was, more information. I think the doctors were more comfortable and confident in what they were doing, and even the nurses in the hospital, and then just the medical team were more confident in their work and their processes. I think for me, the one thing I had to learn to temper was their excitement and positivity. At that point in time, because these were going to be, my first one in particular was going to be approved. And so there was real excitement, like this is really good. But then to really temper that excitement and energy and to look at it for me practically and realistically and like, okay, what does this mean overall for all myeloma patients, which is great. But then where do I fit into that bigger picture? So that was one thing that I learned through it. But I think clinical trials overall, I'm alive because other people have done them. And so if there's the opportunity for my treatment journey takes me to a clinical trial, I will sign up, and all the extra additives that go with it, because people did that for me to get to this stage.
So, and even like Brenda was saying, maybe, going through your phase 1 trials or phase 2 even, but especially phase 1, when these are really the first time that these drugs are in people. And what they're really trying to do is figure out what the best dose is to give people. Essentially, it's like finding the highest dose you can give people without having too toxic side effects. But even that information is so important to be able to move drugs either farther along the clinical trial continuum or discontinue them if they turn out that they're too toxic. So it's something that's important, I think, for all patients to do. And it's a great thing when you can really sort of donate yourself to be able to get that kind of information. So let's talk a little bit about your relationships with your care teams, right? So is it like a collaborative thing where you discuss different treatment options, then decide which one might be the best for you based on your goals and what's happening in your life? And if you did have that kind of collaborative experience with your care team, what can you recommend to other patients to be able to establish that kind of relationship if they don't already have that relationship? John, let's start with you.
I do feel that my relationship with my hematology oncologist and care team here in Miami is extremely collaborative and has been very good. We have very detailed, open discussions around all topics and have throughout this treatment. I actually decided when I had my initial stem cell transplant here at University of Miami in 2016. When that failed in 2018, I made the decision to pursue a second transplant, but at University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences at their Myeloma Institute. And that is the first juncture in my life that I've needed to speak to a physician about seeking a second opinion. I was a little bit nervous to do so. And I remember my doctor calling me. I think I sent him an email first to tell him I was going to kind of slide it out in email and then discuss it at an appointment later. And he called me actually that same day and said, I just want you to know I fully support your going for a second opinion. You should never feel badly about that. Arkansas is a great institution, et cetera. So as we were looking at, I transitioned back to Miami after my second transplant failed. And really my primary doctor's always been here in Miami. So when we were looking at the other options being either CAR T or bispecific, we had a lot of conversations around CAR T and bispecific antibody therapies and Dr. Hoffman's view on those and the similarities, differences, et cetera, in order to arrive at a decision. But really, it was driven by time and my needs more so than anything else.
Yeah, that makes sense because it does. Once you start the CAR T process, it can be at least a month or maybe more before the product is ready. So, and sometimes that's very difficult for patients depending on where they are in their disease. And they may need something very quickly, more off the shelf, which is really more of a bispecific thing at this point. But it's great that your doctor really supported you in seeking out a second opinion. And then you were actually able to come back to that same care team after going somewhere else.
I was. I did all of the induction therapy and the transplant in Arkansas. I then had a couple rounds of extended chemotherapy after I was back. We did that in Miami, and really I transitioned back. They worked in conjunction together. It was a fantastic experience.
Yeah, it's just amazing. Everybody was so cooperative, and that's great. Brenda, what was your experience with your care team like?
I have an excellent care team. I couldn't ask for a better care team. I think it's important that you have a multiple myeloma specialist working with you. And that's what I have. I have a team of specialists working with me. And they actually collaborate among themselves to talk about patients and to see what's the best care for that patient. And then they come back and they actually talk to the patient about what's the care. And they don't talk over you, they talk with you, and they help you to understand exactly what's going on with your care and what you need. As far as clinical trials are concerned, they're always looking for clinical trials that you may fit into. My team is heavy into research, which I'm really grateful for because I like research, and so that's what they do. And there's a lot of people that come to them for treatment services.
So they're a busy place. Actually, it's like the more myeloma patients your doctor sees, the better off you are because they've kind of seen it all.
Absolutely. And they're more comfortable with it. If I needed to have a second opinion, they would not have a problem with having a second opinion. They would not have a problem with me going for a second opinion. I wouldn't need to because they are the specialists there. So why would I need to go somewhere else to find out what they already know?
If you have a doctor and you say to your doctor you want to have a second opinion and your doctor says, I don't advise that, then you know that you need another doctor. Eric, what's your experience like with your care team?
Yeah, I've been blessed. I think at the root of it is, when you talk about collaboration and care, it's really at the heart of the entire team that I've gotten to work with. And in particular, my doctor for the last 11 years has been Dr. Jeffrey Wolf at UCSF. And he exhibits that personally, professionally, and just how he lives that out is really fun for me to watch. I didn't choose him for that reason. I actually was recommended to him when I moved back to California by the MMRF. They recommended saying, hey, you might want to see this doctor. And we clicked right away. And he's always been open to conversation, depth of conversation, and then always giving me the options, giving suggestions or even, recommendations in those options. But what led me even on this CAR T journey was that I was on a treatment that just became too onerous for me. And it was helping and it was working. It was managing the myeloma, but my overall life capacity and wellness, and it was just not going well. And so he said, well, let's try something different because we want you to live the best life possible. And so that's always been my great appreciation. And then with him, his team has been incredible. And one of the doctors in particular, until she recently moved on, Dr. Nina Shaw, she became a great friend because I did Moving Mountains for Myeloma with her, a trip to Iceland, and got to know her and became a friend before she became my doctor for one of the trials. And so to build the relationships and to build the friendships and to build the connectivity, I think the biggest thing is that with this kind of time around with my current doctors, they see me as a person first and then a patient second. And that's really one of the biggest things I felt a lot of times early in my treatment and early in my disease. I felt like I was a problem to be solved, a patient to be treated, and then a person. And I really feel like the reverse is true of my current team and current doctors. I'm a person first, a patient to be treated second, and then the myeloma is the problem to be solved third.
It's an interesting perspective. So let's talk a little bit about some of the patients that you may have met along the way during your treatments, and whether or not you've taken advantage of a multiple myeloma support group and whether or not you found that to be helpful. John, what can you tell us about that?
I have not been involved in a support group per se. I have kept up with several patients that I met during my stem cell transplants to understand how they're doing overall, but I have not yet involved myself in a support group around multiple myeloma or blood cancers.
Just because you really haven't felt the need to have that type of support?
I haven't felt a need overall from that support perspective. I think I just have been busy with everything else. And, trying to balance things hasn't been something that necessarily I have sought out.
Brenda, have you made any friends, any patient friends during your journey, and do you utilize a support group?
I have not utilized a support group. I have, throughout my journey, actually been a mentor and talked with other people who have multiple myeloma or who have been just diagnosed with multiple myeloma. But as anything formal, no. Informal, yes.
So kind of an informal network of support, with other patients who may be going through the same thing or may want to ask your advice on something or find out what your experiences were like. Eric, how about you?
Yes, I think for me, the support group, the relationships have been hugely beneficial and encouraging. I don't think I would be alive today other than the fact that early in my diagnosis, I had a couple what I call mentors in myeloma that came alongside of me who had gone through all of what I was going to go through. They had gone through it before. And so then the advice that they give, the way they lived into the life. And then a couple, like when I was early diagnosed, in those early days in particular, the fellow kind of myeloma warriors that I was going through it with as we were discovering the process together. And then I think there is that place where the support group, and I think probably our support group here in San Francisco might be pretty special because we've got a legendary advocate and myeloma patient in Jack Aiello who cares for us, who leads us, who organizes us, who brings us together and does such an incredible job of keeping us informed, but then allowing us to develop the relationships and build into each other's lives has been so important for me. And then to Brenda, if you're around long enough and you stick at this long enough, that naturally you become a mentor in myeloma yourself, where other people and newly diagnosed patients are asking questions. I think personally for me in that entire process, the place that has been the most unique for me is, and I think I've had to be careful of just even where I fit at times, is I'm not the typical myeloma patient in many ways. And so my story doesn't match with very much of the normative story. And so, it's saying, okay, how can my experience be a benefit to you? How can my story be a benefit to you? What are the things that I've learned that can be, helpful to you? But then what are the ways in which I need to get my story out of the way and help people, understand where they're at in their own journey?
I think that type of experience really helps other patients understand what a variable disease this can be and how different it can be in every person, right? Based on the person's characteristics, based on the therapies that they've had, based on the care teams that they're utilizing. I mean, there's so many differences there. So, but even so, there's pieces that people have gone through, like, most people have gone through a stem cell transplant. So you can talk about that with other patients. And moving forward, as some of these other therapies become more and more common, you'll be able to tell your stories to the next group of immunotherapy patients that are coming up and let them know how you did. Let's wrap up a little bit by talking about what in your experience has been helpful in your journey that you can tell other patients about and maybe advise them about. John, let's start with you.
I thought about this a bit. I think it's been eye-opening as to just how much the patient and the patient's caregiver, the people around them, need to be the advocate during the totality of the process. You have to actively, from my point of view, you're going to achieve the best results if you educate yourself, if you have an open and very conversant relationship with your doctor, with your care team. I echo Brenda's thoughts and Eric's as well. A myeloma specialist, a group, people who see this day in, day out. Acquaint yourself with Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation. I think the materials that are put out by the MMRF are fantastic from an educational perspective, a recap of ASCO perspective, the patient webinars, the seminars, understand where you are in the treatment continuum, what else is out there, and really exercise, take time, self-care for yourself as the patient, and self-care for the caregiver or caregivers as well, being very cognizant and focused on all of that.
It's great advice, and thank you for all your kind words about our educational materials. Eric, let's go with you. What about your experience has been most helpful that you can really advise other patients about?
Having come after my second CAR T cell, and then now I'm in that process of preparing for treatment and what's coming next. I think there's two things that I've learned in the process, or I've had opportunity to reflect on, in particular this last year of being off treatment. That first, there's hope. I think, the debilitating nature and a little bit of the overwhelming nature of the hopelessness that can often be tied to myeloma treatment and myeloma outcomes is something that can be overwhelming. And, the hopelessness that can often kick in, through treatment or at different points in time as you transition between treatments. I do think what I had the opportunity to do this last year of being off treatment was really reflect on my journey, educate myself to what's coming next, but then to sit in that place of hopefulness for more life, extended life, better life, and not just for me, but for my friends like Brenda and John and my other friends who are going through this with me, and then also for our caregivers. And I think that was the second thing that I realized. I mean, I've had great opportunities to do really great things, since I was diagnosed 14 years ago, and really to experience life in a unique way. But I don't think I fully sat in the place of enjoying the life that I was given. And this last year really kind of put me in a place where it was like, you know what, I need to enjoy the peace of life. I began to enjoy the health of life again, just to enjoy the reflection moments of saying, who am I and who have I become? And even some of those places of enjoying the conversations of what I lost through this journey, but yet, what I've been given because of this process and because of this diagnosis and because of this journey. And so for me, I think it is that place where, purposely placing myself in a place of hope and enjoyment, because oftentimes for me, I can be too future focused on what's next. Even now, as I prepare for treatment, I focus on what's next rather than, enjoying today and the moments of today.
Brenda, what advice can you give to other patients?
I agree with everything that John and Eric both said, but also I think that you have to stay positive. You can't have a defeatist attitude about this. This has been a 12-year journey for me. One thing that I had to realize is that relapse is going to be a part of that journey. So it's nothing to be afraid of, nothing to be upset about. It's just a part of it. And I always think of it, you've heard me say about a train ride, and I still think of this as a train ride. And this journey, once the train ride stops, you get off and you get on another ride. And that's how treatment is. Once this treatment stops, you get off and you start another treatment. But you keep moving forward. You just keep moving forward because you're living with multiple myeloma. It's not a death sentence anymore. We're going to live with multiple myeloma, so we have to learn how to live with it. And we just got to keep moving forward.
Amazing words of advice and wisdom from all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Myeloma Matters podcast on targeting immunotherapies in multiple myeloma, hosted by the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation. The MMRF would like to thank John Wayland, Eric Ellefson, and Brenda Clark for sharing their stories and unique perspectives on targeted immunotherapy in myeloma treatment. The MMRF also thanks Adaptive, Amgen, Bristol Myers Squibb, GSK, and Janssen for their generous support of this podcast. If you have additional questions about anything you have heard today, please call the MMRF Patient Navigation Center at 1-888-841-6673 for more information.